wanted to take our seats so we can get started. Welcome to the third day of the third annual Nordic Spirit Symposium held at California Lutheran University, and welcome to our Kensington Runestone Forum. I'd like to make an announcement before we get started here. At Kensington Lutheran Church on Hillcrest Drive on Sunday, March 10th at 4 p.m. there will be a concert, Songs of Norway by Agi Kristoffersen, a pianist in concert. He is a world-class pianist and great entertainer. He has performed at Carnegie Hall, and there will be a free will offering and reception following the concert. You're all invited to attend at Kensington Lutheran Church on Hillcrest Drive in Collinsville, Hillcrest Drive, 4 p.m. Sunday, March 10th. So today we're having a Kensington Runestone Forum. A historical document from 1362, or a witty fake, whose existence tells much about how Scandinavian immigrants related to their new homeland. That is the question. Why a forum on the Kensington Runestone? It's been around, the Runestone's been around for more than 100 years. It's been controversial all that time, with some gaps perhaps. And even some of our own friends, very good friends, are disappointed that we're doing a forum on the subject. They're concerned that we're going to degrade or besmirch our own reputation for the Nordic Spirit Symposium by holding such a forum. But we think that it's important to have this forum, and why do we want to have this forum? One reason is there's been a flurry of activity in the media recently. Let me show you something. This is a free publication. It's called Ripsaw. The title of the article is Verified at Last, the Strange and Terrible Story of the Kensington Runestone. So there's been a flurry of activity, as I said, in the past year or so. Studies of the stone are still going on. Number 3, new information is appearing from those studies, both scientific information on the stone and linguistic interpretation of the inscription. This information has to be evaluated carefully and objectively. If the sources of this information draw conclusions about the validity or age of the inscription, right or wrong, these interpretations must be analyzed by others for concurrence or to show why the interpretations are wrong. Number 4 is a fascinating subject. And I'd like to give a brief, lightly annotated historical overview of the Kensington Runestone. In 1890 or thereabouts, a Swedish immigrant named Olaf Oman settled on new land near Kensington, Minnesota. And about 8 years later, in the autumn of 1898, Oman was grubbing trees from a slight hill on his property. And one of the trees had a stone embedded in its roots. And Oman uprooted the tree. He had to cut some of the roots in the process, and as I understand it, was able to tip the tree over, and the stone remained embedded in the roots. And his 10-year-old son, Edward, came home from school and brought lunch out to him. And perhaps toying with the dirt on the stone, Edward noticed some strange markings on it. One version says he dusted the markings off with his cap. There turned out to be inscriptions both on one face and on one side of the stone. And as they say, the rest is history. Nonetheless, some of the history is blurred. I won't attempt to unblur the history, but we'll give some highlights. A neighbor, Nielsen in Norwegian, was called to look at it, and between them they could not make it out. Word spread, and other neighbors came to see the stone and inscription, One person, Sven Hedberg, wondered if the inscription was Greek, but apparently others recognized the inscription configured as ruins. Late in 1898, the same year, the stone was displayed in a bank in Kensington, some say in Stola. A copy was made of the inscription by J.P. Hedberg, and this was sent to Mr. Turnblad, the publisher of the Swedish language newspaper, Svenska Amerikanska Posten. The Posten sent a copy on to the Greek department of the University of Minnesota, and ultimately the copy reached a professor of Scandinavian languages, Olaf Breda. He made a partial translation. He omitted the numbers, which he couldn't make out, and pronounced the inscription a forgery. On January 14th of that year, 1899, Breda's translation appeared in a University of Minnesota newspaper by the name of Ariel, A-R-I-E-L. A later, more complete translation, which has often been quoted of the Runestone, is 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on discovery journey from Vinland over the west. We had camped by 2 skerry, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were and fished 1 day. After we came home, found 10 men, red with blood, and dead. AVM in capital letters. Saved from evil. Have 10 men by the sea to look after our ship, 14 days' journey from this island. Year 1362. The stone was shipped to Professor George Terming at Northwestern University in Chicago for his analysis, and he ultimately declared it a fake, although he initially wavered on that. Along the way, copies, probably inaccurate copies, were also sent to the University of Oslo professors and outstanding chronologists at Oslo who opined that it was a fake. The big objection to the stone's authenticity by scholars, other than the fact that they doubted that Northmen were in Minnesota in 1362, was the linguistics on the inscription. One big objection made about the inscription was that some of the rooms were modern inventions, probably invented by a Scandinavian American shortly before the stone was discovered. The stone was sent back to Oman, who thereupon used it as a stepping stone to one of his farm buildings, and there the stone lay for many years. Then we jump to 1907. A young aspiring historian by the name of Hjalmar Holland was researching for a book on Norwegian immigration. He heard about the stone, purchased it from Oman, and spent his lifetime researching, writing books, and claiming authenticity of the stone. In so doing, he convinced many in the public that it was indeed genuine. And then we jump to 1932. When he did publish his book, The Kensington Stone, a study in pre-Columbian American history. Following that, many authors got in the act, either defending or opposing the stone's authenticity. 1958, some years later, one author with a major influence, Eric Waldron, a UCLA professor, wrote a book, The Kensington Stone, A Mystery Solved. This book is a scathing attack on both the stone and on Holden, considered by many, such as Harvard scholar Einar Haugen, to be a, quote, conclusive marshalling of the arguments against the authenticity of the famous stone by a professor of Scandinavian languages at UCLA, unquote. Haugen, by the way, is a very, or was, he's now deceased, but he was a very distinguished and fine scholar at Harvard University, a fine Scandinavian scholar. This book has a very detailed analysis of the stone, the book by Eric Waldron, its circumstances, its runic, and the discoverer of the stone. It's somewhat tedious, but there is much important detail in the book. Later, Waldron came out with another book, not totally focused on the stone, titled The Vikings and America. Waldron's book has been described as witty. Whether this conclusion is right or wrong, reading Waldron, however, is really not unlike listening to Rush Limbaugh when he was lambasting and ridiculing Ted Kennedy day after day a few years ago. It's witty if you're on the same side, if your viewpoint's on the same side of the author. If you're on the opposite side, or if you're neutral, it seems kind of unprofessional. I was a little bit put off by it myself. In 1968, Theodore Blagan, a respected historian in Minnesota, wrote a book, The Kensington and Runestone, New Light on an Old Riddle. He again did detailed analysis of the stone, the circumstances of its discovery, the people involved, and so on and so on. And although he couldn't conclusively prove anything one way or the other, he concluded that on the balance it was the case. And then, 1982, Robert A. Hall Jr., a retired Cornell University linguist, published a book, The Kensington Runestone is Genuine, Linguistic, Practical, Methodological Considerations. Hall argued that certain aberrant runes which have been used to prove the stone of hope actually proved the opposite. Hall claimed these alleged aberrant runes actually had been used centuries earlier and had been lost from usage, so that experts around 1900 did not know of their existence, and therefore this stone could not have been inscribed in 1900, around or shortly before 1900, because no one in that time period knew that those runes existed. This almost brings us to Richard Nielsen, one of today's speakers. But let me also mention some of the sidesteps, missteps, and so on around the runestone. In 1962, Margaret Mary Lutner published a so-called Explorer booklet, which claimed that yes, the KRS, the Kensington Runestone, is a hoax, but it's a hoax 626 years old. And then in 1967, a book, North Medieval Cryptography and Runic Carving, was published by Alf Munga and O.G. Lansford. Munga was I think a U.S. Army cryptologist prior to that time. And anyway, they applied cryptography to reveal hidden messages in the stone, and from that he determined the stone's author. And then jumping to 1998, there is a little booklet, Labyrinth of Speculation, published by Ellen Rogers, which is an interesting tongue-in-cheek numerological analysis of the inscription, where he counts the number of letters up to a certain point, and so on, and finds some significance in the numbers that he gives. And then, now just 2 years ago, in 2000, there's another publication claiming that the message is authentic, but that the men red with blood and dead had not been killed by Native Americans, but that they died from the Black Earth. So those are more food for thought. There's a lot of interesting speculation, very emotional topic. Some scholars are very emotional about the subject. Some non-scholars are very emotional about the subject. I think today we'll have a less emotional conversation with our speakers. I'd like to conclude with a relatively recent quotation from Olaf Ullman's great-grandson from 2 years ago, August of 2000. Quote, "The greatest mystery that I would like to solve is the Kensington Runestone." A little background on it. The Kensington Runestone was found in Minnesota on November 8, 1898, by my great-grandfather. The stone states that Norsemen were here 200 to 300 years before Christopher Columbus. Since its time of discovery, it has been disputed by scholars for over 100 years. I really don't care if it is proven to be true or false. I see it two ways. First, if it is true, my great-grandfather found something very significant to U.S. history. Otherwise, my great-grandfather pulled off one of history's greatest practical jokes. That is the great mystery that I would like to solve. End of quote. So, the question today is, are Barry Hanson, Richard Nielsen, and Henrik Williams going to solve the mystery? Well, I'm tempted to say, let the games begin, but this really isn't a game, and there are serious questions here, but we'll soon find out. So I'd like to reintroduce our first speaker, Barry Hanson. Barry is semi-retired and owns and operates Dakota Scientific Incorporated in a very pleasant, quiet region of northern Wisconsin. Barry received a bachelor's degree in chemistry from St. Louis College, Northfield, Minnesota, one of the top undergraduate chemistry departments in the nation. He did this in 1964. He later studied philosophy at the University of Washington and engineering at the University of Colorado, and worked as a project manager for a consulting engineering firm in Denver. If my memory is correct, Barry in his early years believed the stone was a hoax, as, despite some opinions, really has been the prevalent view of the Scandinavian American public in the upper Midwest. However, when Barry learned more about it, he felt something wasn't right, and he began his own search for the truth. So I'd like to turn over the podium to Barry.
Thank you for having me. I do think we have some new information, some significant new events I'd like to first of all pass on to you. The University of Minnesota recently approved a graduate thesis dealing with the Kensington Runestone, and have talked to the lady doing it, and it will be complementary to the type of work that we're doing and the research we're doing. So we're very glad to see this, because this is a form of stuff by academic means. Also at the University of Minnesota, I have worked with Dr. Paul Weidland, and we have the first scientific report on the surface of physical features of the Kensington stone. This we consider significant too, because Dr. Weidland is an internationally known and respected geophysicist. When he started working with us, he was probably a little skeptical too, but I think the important point is that he's still working. So we have his report. The other significant event, I think, is the fact that a highly regarded Scandinavian language journal saw fit to publish Dr. Richard Nielsen's work this past summer. This is a milestone for us. I'm very happy for that. And I guess the only other thing is that we have formed a nonprofit group to enable us to finance and fund and pursue some of the associated research. You might say associated with the Kensington stone is not maybe it's just interesting research. There are 5 areas that I think are necessary to address, regardless of what side of the question you come down. So you think it's a hoax, or you think it's authentic. There are 5 things that you should really address. Those things are dialect. The Kensington stone does show a clear dialect. The rune forms themselves, that is, the letters on the stone, need to be discussed and talked about. The words on the stone need to be talked about, and the syntax, the placement of those words in sentence construction. There are numbers that appear on a Kensington stone. This is an area that needs to be addressed, regardless of which side. And the last one are physical features. This is the topic that I'm going to focus on today. And this is nothing more than the chemistry of the surface of this stone. We're here today to really make an appeal, I think. We're here not to try to convince you that this stone is authentic. Well, the real reason we're here is to make an appeal for study and continued serious research on the Kensington stone. We think that there is enough material here to warrant that, and that is our appeal. I have another agenda, and that is the fact that I'm just now finishing up a book. It's a 600-page book, 8.5 by 11 format. It's going to weigh about 8 pounds. But what I did was I made an effort to examine the whole corpus of literature surrounding the Kensington stone. I looked at about 45 books and documents, and I examined the work of everyone that I could find in the literature that considered the Kensington stone to be important. What I did was I took their work and simply quoted them directly in the left column, so you could decide for yourself what you think about the exact words that say. Then in the right column, I put what I considered to be new evidence, new data that would go along with their work. So it's kind of a comprehensive treatment, I hope. I hope it adds to the overall understanding of the Kensington Runestone. The subject, the title of my book is called The Kensington Runestone, A Defense of Olafoma. Forgeries require a forgery. Oftentimes, this gentleman is forgotten in the shop. He had 9 children in a very marginal farm. He was a poor man. In general, over the last 100 years of this controversy, this man has been accused of forging a fairly complex medieval document. It was my feeling that in this great country of ours, everybody who is accused of any conspiracy, deserves a due process. If you're going to make the accusation, I think it's fair that you also present the data and the evidence to support his accusation. So, my approach, and the reason I'm here really today, is to defend the man you see on the screen right there. His family suffered. Basically, this controversy devastated him. And I don't think that should be lost in itself. I think that's a very important consideration. It's not very scientific, and we're not going to be talking about science, but I think that you'll see how this ties in. The hallmark is another shot of the Kensington Stone. The hallmarks of this controversy are really not the fact that there is an inability to sort out the facts and evidence to decide if this is valid or not. The real hallmark of this controversy is the fact that there's a failure to study the documents that are involved. And this is quite a substantive difference. There are believers or people accuse us of being believers. They speak in terms of non-believers and believers. I like to answer that with, yes, indeed, I'm a believer. I'm a believer in responsible editorial oversight. And I'm a believer in responsible science and simply generating data that will withstand the scrutiny of the scientific community. I'm a strong believer in it. I think if you have an opinion, then you should support it with evidence and publish that evidence so the rest of the community can examine how you arrived at your opinion. That's what I believe in. So when I first became interested in this issue, I thought this is going to be interesting to me as a scientist to see what other scientists thought about the surface of the stone. I was just curious. I thought, well, somebody has to look at this, and I'd sure be interested in what their opinion is. So I looked in the literature and tried to find everything I could about any kind of credible observation that was made on the surface of the Kensington stone. To my amazement, I found out that no one had ever looked at the Kensington Runestone scientifically. No one had ever taken a modern microscope and looked at it. It's incredible. These people are saying it's a fake forgery. Certainly, I think they would want to see what it looks like close up. So I did write an article. It was published in Journal of the West out of Kansas State University. And I simply published my findings in terms of the historical record and who the credible observers were and what they saw when they looked at the Kensington stone. The first thing is no scientist really ever took it into a modern lab. The other thing is that all people who ever looked at the Kensington Runestone from a scientific perspective thought it was authentic. I couldn't find one person in the record in terms of the scientific geologist that looked at it and said, this was recently carved. I thought that was interesting. At least I couldn't find anything. So at any rate, this was published then in February 2000, and it was based upon this article because in addition to the historical record, I also made 9 specific recommendations to testing the stone in terms of the chemistry and the geochemistry of the stone. So it's based upon this that the Runestone Foundation authorized me to coordinate the scientific study of the stone, which I did for 1 year. I'm off on other things now, but I did that for 1 year. Now we'll be reporting on that today, the results. The seeds for my ideas, I think, in terms of the science of this stone, come from this image that you see on the screen. Sitting in front of our fireplace, reading National Geographic, and I was fascinated with that carving because it was disputed from Esteban in Yugoslavia. It was argued that this was not possible in tens of thousands of years. The old quality is just too good for that. You can see the features of this man's face. This is a quality carving. And they decided, upon looking at it closely with a microscope, that there was mineralization that occurred in certain grooves, in certain cracks, over man-made features of that carving. Now, it was just a short little article in National Geographic, but it struck me because they showed conclusively that that carving is 26,000 years old. What a neat idea. They found mineralization over what they identified as man-made, and then they dated the man-made. So we took the stone to the lab. And this is the lab. That's the gentleman that owns the lab, Scott Walters, is a geologist. He had a very nice, fine, modern facility that gave us a secure place to have the stone to allow scientists to come in. Gentleman right there, Dr. Zico Chikangas, is a well-known sedimentary geologist. That's a person who I contacted initially. His name is Scott's name. That's Charlie Nash. He's a very well-known glacial geologist. The stone does have glacial striations on it. This is a gentleman that I ended up working primarily with. That's Dr. Paul Wyman, who's a geophysicist at the University of Minnesota. He's very well known. He actually is the person that they gave the moon rock to when they first brought it back. Highly regarded gentleman. We're very fortunate to have him working. Just another shot as we're looking over the stone, trying to get ideas how to approach this scientifically. What kind of data do we think we could generate here? The task is to put together a good group of people, I guess, and it's kind of a daunting task. Because you need to find the scientists, you need to write the testing protocols, you need to somehow come up with the equipment to do the testing. And so it's about as complicated as any, I guess, engineering project that I was involved in, and I used to coordinate some pretty good sized projects here, but you're dealing with a lot of different consultants, you're dealing with design work and whatnot. There's a lot of similarities here. But what we're really trying to do here with the Kensington stone is take this gentleman off the hook if he deserves to be taken off the hook. We're trying to establish whether or not the Kensington stone was in the ground for an appreciable period of time before it was found. This man was only on his land for 8 years. There's no hypothesis that I know of that has been brought forward that does not include either Olaf Ullman or his contemporaries. Because without Olaf Ullman, it would seem that we do not have any kind of a reasonable hypothesis before it. So, from a scientific standpoint, what I'm really trying to do here is decide and try to determine if that stone was in the ground for longer than 8 years, it would be very difficult to do this project. So, we're looking now. This is just another shot of a stone, and we will start with a very brief discussion of the points on the stone that we looked at for samples. Put up. Okay, a close-up. We find that there are 4 basic surfaces that we're working with. So, we have the back side of the stone, which shows glacial striation, therefore indicating an age of about 10,000 years at least. We have fresh samples of the stone. Stone has never been exposed to the atmosphere of the soil. And then we have the interesting surfaces in between. This stone, incidentally, has been abused quite horribly through the years. It's been scraped with nails, it's been It's been mistreated, I think, quite seriously. In fact, that's caused a lot of confusion in terms of people looking at it and saying, well, it looks new. And actually, the white brightness here is really what's called crystal segregation. It's a highly siliceous silicon-bearing matrix. And when it's straight, you can see under a microscope, the crystals just segregate. It's almost like you turn the lights on. And so you can't really use that as any kind of a criteria for age. But what you can use are areas of the stone, as you see here, that gave the carver some problem. When they tried to carve this O or this really K, that's the word off, the stone spalled, it broke out. The same thing happened here. The stone spalled out and it had to recarve the room. What that tells us is that there's a surface here, and a surface in here that ostensibly is the same age as the rune form itself. In other words, what we think we're looking at here is a man-made feature that was exposed at the same time as the rune was carved. You see an area here, the same thing happened to, and that is the word Bessie. The beginning of the second line, we can see how the stone has fallen off. At that point, so no one will ever know what rune came before this one runic eye here. But this is an example of how the stone has fallen off. Another fairly good close-up here is the slight magnification. And you can see here, once again, the falling effect. So what we're saying is that this area here is probably the same age as the rune form itself. So what that does is it gives us the surface for control purposes or for sampling purposes. We see other interesting things. We brought a lady in to look at the stone who's an expert stone carver. She saw things that geologists couldn't see because her expertise is in a really different area. She holds a chisel and carves into stone as a living. And so she was looking at this from a stone carver's perspective, something a geologist can't do because they're not stone carvers. But she said, if I was going to carve the stone, the first thing I would do would be to hit into the stone someplace else to test the chisel and to test the feel of that stone. And so she found a mark which we've identified as a practice chisel line. We've done that under the microscope by measuring and whatnot, so we're fairly confident in that. So what that does is it gives us a very clean, unmolested mark which we think was done in 1362 or at the same time as the runes were carved. You see other features. These marks here show that this stone was hit very hard, about 6 times, with a chisel-type blunt instrument to dress it. In other words, they're trying basically here to dress this surface, and they found a cleavage plane, and they didn't know what they were doing. They hit the stone in the right place to cleave it right off at that point. But this also becomes then another test point which we think was done at the same time as the runes were carved. We see other features that can be used as sampling points. The geologist Newton Winchell took a chip from the stone in 1910. The practice cut is down here. You see an H here. We know that that was carved into the stone in 1908. So the significance of that is that if we have something that we know was done in 1908, and we're trying to compare it to something that was done at an unknown time, we now have a control with which to do that. At Stanford University, they've done quite a bit of work with a 3-dimensional laser imaging device. This is something that they developed up there. And I talked to those people. They're willing to help us. It's actually another machine from Laval University in Canada. And what you would do in this case is just very carefully show in 3 dimensions with this laser imaging the upper feature of where it was cut into the stone and examine it for incipient weathering, for example. If you see a difference, if you can quantify, then you have some data. In addition to just simply looking at a 3-dimensional picture, We are also interested in the geochemistry of this surface compared to the geochemistry of that surface. That's the first approach that we've taken to looking at the stone. Because once the stone is carved into, the silicates in the stone itself can be examined on a molecular level. And that's basically what we get. We are now in the process of doing that. I think we have about half a dozen strategies for that. I think the most promising strategy is one that you can see this discoloration, and what that is a form of manganese oxide that is precipitated out on the surface of a man-made feature of the stone. This would represent what I call episodes of mineralization. We identify the manganese oxide, we identify the conditions under which that could form, and we know that it formed on top of a man-made feature. This then starts to enable us to get somewhat of a grip on a time frame. In other words, if we can show conceivably that took more than 8 years, it's looking pretty good for the following. We see other types of mineralization. This is a form of iron oxide. But once again, the minerals are forming over a man-made surface. So we have two features in a layer. This is very important because this is what will enable us to assign a time frame to the overall process. We found that when we started looking at the stone under a microscope, that it didn't seem to have been exposed to the atmosphere for a long time. It seems as though the stone was in the ground or soil environment for a much longer time than it was exposed to the atmosphere. The conclusions I can say now, though, are that stone was in the ground. And it was in the ground for what you have to say is a considerable period of time. Looking at 50 years to 200 years, no one can say, but we can say that it was in the ground. This is a scanning electron micrograph of silicates taken from a fresh part of the stone. And this is the same material on a part of the stone that was done at the same time that the runes were carved. This has been interpreted as a form of mica degradation. This is preliminary data. This is not definitive data. But you can look at that and you can once you've identified the type of mica, and then you can say, this is a form of degradation. It took a considerable amount of time. It took a wet soil environment to occur in, and we think that that's probably well over 50 years, probably not 200 years to occur. The interesting feature on the back of the stone, you'll see the two white streaks. You couldn't figure out what those were. They didn't have a really geological explanation. One of the people said, well, that they seen occur when roots were in contact with stone. So we did find someone at the university who has done a lot of work with roots in contact with the stone and said, yes, it looks like an oxalic acid effect, and maybe that's something that we should take a closer look at. So we did take a sample, core out at that feature, and it also comes along the side of the stone. And cored it out, did a two section. This here shows the horizon of that beached out area. And this is only 1 millimeter here. It's like a 32nd of an inch or something. It's a very small space here. But you can see that there is a chemical effect in the gray wax etching. We think that is caused, it's an oxalic acid effect. We think that is caused from roots. Now it's interesting that this was described as being found with the roots ripping it initially. No one's ever been able to explain that. Once again, this is not definitive information. It's more of what you would say corroborative information. But we think it's interesting because the witnesses that were there at the time testified that the root was 3 inches. A full 3-inch diameter root gripping the stone, and this would just simply be additional evidence to that effect. Other things that we're looking at, there's a chance that since this stone was designed obviously to stand upright in the ground, You can take samples out of the backside of the stone. You only need about 1 milligram per sample to do what's called a bulk chemical analysis. And if it was in the ground, it could very well be, and this is in process now, a selective chemical adsorption would be the term underground, and a selective loss of minerals above ground. Now, this is something that's not easy to observe, but with the right equipment, and the bulk chemical analysis is really mass spectrometer. So we're looking at very, very small amounts, parts per billion or parts per trillion of trace cells. So we're looking at very subtle differences here. But nonetheless, those differences we think can be described. If we could suggest then that stone was upright, standing upright in the ground for a considerable period of time, that would not be something you'd expect to occur naturally. And so once again, it would be corroborative evidence that the Kensington stone is standing upright in the ground for a long time. It would also suggest that it could not have been faked by a farmer because these processes take a considerable amount of time to manifest themselves. There are just another shot of the stone. I'd probably spend more time than anyone looking at it under a microscope, and I'll have to say that it's thrilling. If you have a good zoom microscope, you can look down into the ruins. It's like flying over the Grand Canyon or something. It's vertical, it's exaggerated. And you look down in there, and you did this to analyze the chisel marks and whatnot, to analyze the cancer of the carbon, but also I was looking for mineralization and that type of thing. So, one of the things we looked at is the calcite. This is a hydrothermal calcite deposit. They carved about 10 runes through the calcite into the gray lag. So you have two different types of minerals here where the differential weathering can be examined. This is not something that could be faked because the difference between the weathering effect of two different minerals occurring over a long period of time is going to show up over a very short period of time. It wouldn't show up. So that is another strategy. The work that's been done to date, the Weigland report, is a description, really, of the mineralogy of the Kensington stone. It's only the first step. What we did was an electron microprobe analysis to describe the silicate chemistry of the stone. Using that as a base, we can then move to the other sampling points. The changes that take place in silicates are well known in the literature, and by describing on a molecular level the changes in the silicates as they weather, they hydrate, certain feldspars will hydrate, and they will take on water molecules, and that begins a deterioration process toward clay, technically toward clay. Also, we see a selective movement of certain ions, sodium and potassium, out of certain sites on a molecular level in the feldspar. This is how the stone is being described, and this also has a relationship to time. I hope I'm making myself clear. I'm trying to figure out a way, that you can visualize this process. I think the easiest way to do it is to say when you cut into a stone that is made up of silicate minerals, and then that stone is exposed to soil or a moist environment for a long period of time, certain modifications take place on a molecular level to those silicates. We're looking at those very specific molecular changes to the mineral. Dr. Weigland, at this point, has said this. He said, I agree with Newton and Chip. He never deviated from his opinion of the Kensington stone was authentic. He was the first geologist to look at it and wrote the report in 1910 for the Historical Society. He said, we've got a lot of work to do, but he said, I'll tell you right now, there's not a question in my mind. The stone is in the ground. It's in the ground for a considerable period of time. And he said, furthermore, Newton Winchell was no casual observer. Even though it was 1910, he didn't have standing like a microscope. He had 50 years of experience observing the weathering of minerals. And he wrote enough to cover 4 feet on a library shelf. And he also has his name above, in concrete, above the door of a major building on the University of Minnesota campus. He's a highly regarded geologist. Dr. Wyland agrees with him 100%. So you can call that definitive or not. I suppose no matter how much work we do, it's never going to be definitive enough. But when you see minerals that have formed over silicates that you can describe the weathering from, it couldn't have been fake. Or if you think it could be fake, please show us the mechanism by which that could be done, and no one certainly is trying to do that. I'm adding some other material to the presentation today because a lot of people have asked me about this. And maybe there's a third avenue. Dr. Nielsen has pursued the language. I've started to pursue the scientific look at the surface. Maybe there's a third avenue. There are other, I suppose, phenomena that have turned up over in western Minnesota, and people find them very interesting, including myself. This is a potential habitation site, and I say it's a habitation site because I've talked to the Smithsonian back and forth numerous times about this, asking their opinion. They're very helpful to us sometimes. But anyway, they do have some authorities there on North structures, and I said, what is this? They said, well, some pioneers probably did. But no, we know the history. It was like this in 1870 when the first pioneers came to this site. These stones are 5,000 to 6,000 pounds. They have a flat surface, and they're oriented to be palmed and squared. Now, anybody probably would have dismissed it, except, that it was that way in 1870, and it was described by the very first pioneer in the area as being exactly like that in 1870. It was a 90-year-old gentleman that community was in 1960. But I said to the Smithsonian, what do you think? They said, we think it's a habitation site. We think we should initiate some kind of archaeological project. We're not going to do it. We're not going to pay for it. But we think that we should look at it. Get it closer. This is over 17 miles from Kensington. That's just a plan view of that site. It's on Virgin Prairie. It's up on a hill. Very interesting. We have some things that we think that we can do here. These stones are big enough that could attract bugs, things with protein. Under there, we think that we could maybe have a chance of identifying some protein and do what's called an amino acid racemization study. This is a very accurate way to date things within this time frame. So the Smithsonian agreed they thought that was a good idea. We're also looking at lichen studies. There's some new papers now that have been done that show that you can date lichen phalli, and lichens will stay on a stone for 400 to 1,000 years. And that's a mechanism. But at any rate, the Smithsonian thinks that that's worth pursuing. There are many other artifacts that have been found that simply cannot be explained. Hand-forged iron ore. They're found piled up out of virgin soil. Pioneers. The first thing they weren't brought by pioneers. They don't show up in any trade museum collections. They don't show up in any collections that I can find at the time. They're interesting simply because they are hand-forged iron. Somebody went to the trouble also of reducing the iron. That looks very much as doing the testing that this is pre-crucible iron. They used a cladding process. So they were able to carburize this part of the iron and cladded it onto this by hand, and they made this whole thing. So if somebody did that in a blacksmith shop, 30s more powerful, but definitely have 10 to 12 examples. The only reason we're looking at them is because we think they're interesting, and no one else is willing to study them. Now, the University of California has been very kind and have offered to help us. They've developed a new carbon extraction technique for actually dating iron. They're very interested in helping us date these artifacts. They are taking them very seriously. And so we're going to try to work with them. And the University of Minnesota is also helping us. We can do what's called lead isotope ratio analysis. This is done with what's called a inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer, and enables us to identify trace elements once again with the fingerprint of iron and we can trace it originally. Another one of these axes which just happens to have been in very, very pristine condition. position, but it was given to one of the first pioneers in the area by the Indians. So, it's just a fun mystery right now. This is a triangular hole. There's about 50 of these that have been found just along the Runestone Valley over in South Dakota, and you have a lady who's trying to solve this mystery. People have said that they're blasting holes for foundations, but yet they don't appear to be blasting holes. She's done some very interesting ethno history. She's interviewed all the old people. She found out they're not blasting. We're not calling them mooring holes, that's for sure. We're not saying anything except we don't know what they are, and they're interesting. Here's 50 of them all clustered at one elevation level, 1160 along Runestone Valley in South Dakota. And the pioneers didn't do them. So somebody did them, and we do have some iron samples in the bottom of them, and we think we can also employ the lichen study, because we see lichens going on. We've got a lot of samples, but my idea is to just drill one out and take it in the lab and start spicing it up. But maybe this is the third area, because a third avenue toward authenticating the Runestone. Because everyone says to me, no, you're never going to really solve that problem until you find the body. You've got to find the whole body, and you've got to find some kind of an artifact that everybody can touch and accept. Yeah, it's an interesting third avenue, perhaps, and I hope that we can get funded to continue that. There are other runestones. And I'm going to end my presentation at this point, but the Kensington stone is not new. Very interesting in this series.
The original plan wasn't, but we're just going to take a little bit of a break to make sure the third speaker doesn't miss any of Richard Nielsen's talk. Before we take questions, I'd like to just deviate a little bit, give Barry's voice a little rest. Could somebody point out where here the Sunbird is in the audience? Oh, right in the second row, right behind me, where I was sitting. Somebody let loose with a secret to me this morning that you remember that Gerda was here yesterday afternoon and received an award from us for her magic, her wonderful Ribbons of Memory project. I know that all of you weren't here yesterday, but I think most of you were. And somebody let out a secret that today is her birthday. Oh. So I'm not a singer, but I'd request someone in the audience who can sing to lead a happy birthday to Gerda for me. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Gerda. Happy birthday to you. And many more. Let's just take a question or two while we wait for Henry to come back. Jerry, you want to take a question? I think Brody was.
Well, my question was on the surface analysis and whether you've already, first of all, what restrictions the foundation is putting as to what kind of samples you can take off of the stone, and secondly, whether you've already got the samples removed, and what the time frame is for Weidman. When do you expect to have results on the samples from the rock?
It's hard to say. Everything has to be done step by step. I'm actually was only authorized for a year coordinating the state. I'm no longer coordinating the state. I'm now project manager for archaeology. I am a separate entity. We have offered to do the study for the Runestone Museum at no cost, but it remains to be seen what their decision will be. We've actually requested the samples. I do have help supposedly coming from the Smithsonian for the expertise to take these samples off. We only need one known grant sample. but yet you still want somebody with tremendous amount of expertise in working with stone artifacts to take those samples. So we have a request. We'll see what happens. We're also, going speed forward with all these other projects with archaeology and because we think it's real fertile down here too. So a lot of this will apply back to the Kensington stone possibly with the iron work. I actually saw some crucible lichen on the Kensington stone. I think that was very interesting. It was on a man-made surface, and there it was. And I think that should definitely be the lichen could have been on there before.
Here, let's take one more question over here. As a scientist myself, I've always been engaged in research which looks at multiple vectors at a problem area and using interdisciplinary kinds of resources. I'm quite curious about the medial side of this, and are there anthropologists or people with this background who are also thinking this is in the same side to electrochemical and geophysical work?
Well, the lichen work is botany, and we found a person who's got a lot of experience in lichenometry, it's called. By anthropology, I'm not quite sure what you mean, because what we tended to do is go toward the hard science. We tended to go, the protocols that I'm talking about require an analytical geochemist. A geologist cannot do this. And so you're getting into specialties. Not only that, you'd like to see experience in silicate from an analytical geochemist. And I don't have any money to do that. So these people are being very kind, but we're really tending to go toward the harder sciences in order to generate the hard data. So I don't see the involvement of anthropologists at this point, other than the graduate degree at university is out of the anthropology project that we're doing now. Did that answer your question?
Obviously, the stone needs to get there by itself. It needs to carve by itself. More than likely, Homo sapiens or something. Okay, so somebody has to look at the rest of what they left behind.
Well,
that's what I'm talking about.
These are the projects that I mentioned. It's why I brought in the site, the habitation site, and the axes, and there's actually some other things too that I didn't even mention. But yeah, that would definitely be archaeology and anthropology. Yeah, no doubt about it. The disappointing thing, though, is that the established archaeologists and anthropologists don't seem to be that interested. I have to go to communities and talk to the people that think that, farm and stand to find something to see interested in this issue. So, a little bit disappointing in that regard.
Okay, so we're going to limit the questions now, and let me just describe a little bit better the format that we're following today. We do have a panel discussion this afternoon that follows all three talks. And so we're going to ask you to write out your questions. We have blue cards. There's a bunch of blue cards on the at the back of the room, and we request that you write out your questions and give them to the panel, and they will select what they find to be the most beneficial questions and simply discuss them. So in the interest of time, we're going to limit questions usually after the talk. One other thing to mention is that we're going to, in the middle of the afternoon, we're going to move over to another hall. We're going to move to Overton Hall. That's the same hall where you had lunch yesterday, for those of you who were here yesterday. We reserved this Voice Grant Forum about a year ago. However, somebody else reserved it for late this afternoon, a year and a half ago. And so they had precedence for us for the last half of the afternoon, and so we have to move over to the Overton Hall. And we'll do that after Richard Nielsen's talk, and we'll go over there and we'll have Henry Williams' talk, and then the panel discussion. We'll also have a coffee break over in the vicinity of Overton Hall, just across the way from the Quan Quan Gallery. And so I'd like to go on now then and introduce Richard Nielsen.
And there's a biography for him in your handout, and I won't read all the biography to you, but I'll just remind you that Richard has a Doctor of Technology degree from the University of Denmark in Copenhagen, which he got in 1965. He also studied at the University of Michigan, where he received his master's degree in applied mathematics and MS in engineering. He's a 1955 graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. And he spent a number of years in Europe. He was a consulting engineer between 1974 and 1985, including several years in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, where he developed an academic interest in runic inscriptions. His background in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish has made it possible to evaluate Scandinavian literature on runic inscriptions and use these in his comprehensive analysis of proposed North American runic inscriptions. He has published in one form or another several detailed analyses of the runic inscriptions on the Kensington Runestone and compared them with other available runes. And some people ask, well, what's his qualifications? He's not a runologist. He hasn't been trained as a runologist. I suspect that when Dick was studying for his doctorate degree, I suspect that he and his colleagues, his other graduate students, were given the understanding that once they got to that level, that they were supposed to be able to go out in a new field on their own and self-teach themselves in a new field. And that, at least, is what Dick has certainly done. He spent many years studying runes. And so at this time, I'll call on Dick to tell us about his recent work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. It was a privilege to come here on an ad hoc basis 2 years ago, and some of you heard me speak. I was on the panel, and that's the, I guess, start of the organization for this afternoon. There was enough interest generated then in the Kensington Runestone to set up the panel today. So I certainly thank you very much, Howard, for your hard work in that organization and all those things you had to do, particularly getting Professor Henry Williams up so long. That's a real privilege that you've done that. People always ask me, well, why are you such a nut about the Kensington Runestone? I thought I didn't need the Kensington Runestone to be a nut. I'll have to blame my time in Denmark when my wife Judy, who's sitting over there, insisted on seeing the plaster artwork in all the Danish churches, and there's a lot of those medieval churches that exist still in Denmark. And of course, my young son, sitting over there, now 25, huge Viking he is, Thea, he was about 5 years old, and we would frolic in the cemetery. While she was looking at these paintings that I had no interest in designing, so I must admit some of them were ruined. But anyway, many of these churches had runestones or replicas of the runestone that had existed in the churchyard at one time, and so I got quite interested in looking at them. And I was working as a consulting engineer for oil and gas projects in all three countries, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. The opportunity to visit all the museums, look at many of the famous runestones in the field, like the Rockstad in Sweden. And it was I just found that interesting. So when I came back, after having spent over 11 years as a consulting engineer abroad, including some time in Spain and also Australia and New Zealand, I decided that I would take up the Kensington Runestone in order to enable me to read Danish often. Otherwise, I knew I would lose any skill I had in the language. Now, I had read about the Kensington Runestone when I was in the 4th and 5th grade. It was a book by Holland, and it intrigued me, and I had remembered that. But I was confused by all the arguments when I picked up the Walden's book, and I decided that I would just try to marshal the pro and con arguments just to try to figure it out for myself. I mean, it was quite confusing when I looked at Walden's book compared to Pullman's book. Can you help me with once you skip the first slide and go to the second one? Sorry for the wait here. I'll proceed though. I read the articles that were published at the Smithsonian Institute in 1963, and in summary, particularly the Danish immunologists Carl Martin Nielsen and Eric Moltke. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this today because they identified the 4 sure proofs of forgery of the Kensington Runestone. And this was the J rune, the double dotted O, the double dotted A, and the word Upsdagata. All of these were claimed by them to be modern. And modern would be defined as, say, post 1525 or something like that. When the age of printing came in, you would think it was this. And Swedish and Danish books began to be printed already in the 1480s and 1520. But of course, the Swedish Bible was published, and the Danish Bible was published in this period as well, in the 1520s and 30s, and of course that set the modern Swedish and modern Danish languages. So I was in Norway on work with Bechtel Corporation out of San Francisco extensively during the summer of '85, and I started looking into things, and the first thing I looked at was the Kensington Runestone, and I started looking on the J rune argument. Here's the J rune, what they call the J rune. This one here is 10. But as a mathematician, I immediately recognized that the 10, that particular rune was the Arab 10. The claim by the opponents of the Kensington Runestone was that the carver did not know how to make a 10, so he put the 0 from the 10 on top of the save to make this lollipop succeed. So my only question was, how did the Scandinavians know Arab numbers in 1362? Turns out that the various books have been translated from Latin that had been translated from the Arabic. So the Arab numbers were used already in Iceland by 1300. There were whole books published by Oxford, for example, in Iceland and Norway, published in 1325. So the fact that they knew about Arab numbers was established in my mind at least. So of course this piqued my interest considerably. If the so-called experts, or the experts who pronounced on the stone, didn't know this fact, then what other facts did they know? So that's that was lucky for me because it certainly made me think I was on the right track. But what I concentrated on was not trying to find a modern explanation for the Kensington Runestone, but to try always to find the 14th century explanation, leading the task of proving it to be a modern inscription to the plethora of experts who pronounced on it. But the other rune that was supposed to be the sure proof was the J rune, and this was crazy because the J rune doesn't really exist. There is a rune that looks like it, and I found that within 4 months of my study. And now, because I was more proficient in Danish and Norwegian, and certainly I was in Swedish at that time, this is 15 years ago, I decided, I read the Danish material first, and it didn't take me very long to find that they had something called, what they called J-like rune in the Cordis Lunatus, which is the Scansia law, which is probably one of the most famous laws in Scandinavia. But this law has been written in a rune book completely. It's over 100 pages. And this rune exists in that book. And even some of the runologists who said it didn't exist are talking about this rune in other of their own publications. Eric Moltke, for example. I found this just very, very startling. So, again, it also exists in this verse. The music too is what you find on Danish radio. So it's the oldest verse in music that's recorded in Scandinavia. So there was no reason to have ever ignored this rune form. So already in my mind, I have found an explanation for one of the four most serious proofs of forgery, according to the opponent. The next thing I looked at, if you could give me the list of 50. Fear not, we're not going to go into detail here. There's this word, Abdagatha pause. Here's the J rune in a word. I probably should say this word, I call it an enigmatic word because it could have many, many meanings. Shelters and Kinsman may be one of those meanings. But Abdagatha is a sure proof of forgery, according to the opponent. The double dotted rune, the double dotted A, the double dotted O are seen here. There's a double dotted O, there's a double dotted A. The double dotted notation, the diacritics came into book printing days in Sweden. The double dots are not actually used in Norwegian or Denmark. They use the O with a line through a diagonal for the same notation. But the thing I noticed with Abdagatha is this. This rune stands for TH, or Ez, which is a voiced TH. We won't get into that detail. But, and I said, well, why are they calling this Abdagatha? The only way they can call it Abdagatha is they're claiming that the forger did not know that rune stood for TH, but he thought it stood for D. Post-Reformational rune inscriptions, which exist in Scandinavia, quite often have that rune standing for D because the TH went out of the language. It said Scandinavian around 1400. They still used it in some of their writing, but it was not pronounced, apparently. So it was easy for the forgery theory to say, well, he didn't know that this was a D rune. But the other thing that, speaking of Oman, he had a book called Rosander, authored by Rosander. And in this book, there's a description of the Swedish language and description of the runes. And Rosander's book has runes for the D rune, which were not used on the Kensington Runestone. And when they describe the thorn rune in Rosander's book, they're specifically saying it stands for TH. But the critics always said that Ullman had everything he needed to know in Rosander's book except one thing. Didn't name that one thing, but actually Rosander's book doesn't tell you very much at all. In fact, it tells you how to carve the Kensington Runestone correctly, if you wish, without the J rune, without the. And had he used Rosander, we wouldn't have the questions on the runes that have arisen since that time. Now, we're not going much into the runes today because this is mainly on linguistic issues. But the runes come into this because you have to interpret what the rune represents as far as its letters before you can attack it in linguistics. Well, the first thing I noticed was that Upsaga, which really means uptake, It's a very common Scandinavian word. And this is my own feeling. It probably came from a farmer plowing in the field, and he hits a rock and he takes it up. Because there's another alternative meaning of this with hittipo. He hits the rock. Hittipo means discover. But the uptake could be thought of as discovery, or you acquire this rock. I use the translation of acquisition. Updagasis is also used for the assumption of Mary into heaven in the medieval literature. So the assumption is the acquisition of heaven of Mary, I guess. But the issue was the word was never with the D, in my opinion. The reason the D was selected is because the word Updaga with the D was thought to be a modern word. And it was first found in Danish, according to the opponents, around 1700, maybe 1675, in Danish. However, I have succeeded in finding that Updaga was used already in the 1500s in Denmark. So that has brought it at least close to the medieval times. But if the runes are interpreted correctly, then we have Updaga. Now, in my trips to Norway, I got to know Dr. James Knurr, born in Michigan, graduate of Yale, runologist, very clever linguist, and we worked together a lot. We didn't agree very much. He was very conservative in his point of view, but he helped me a lot in these early days. And I had the opportunity of visiting Norway maybe 3 times a year, and I was able to acquire my own library by using the used books and, build up my collection and do a lot of reading. But of course, at that time, Dr. Knurr said that you didn't have a TH substituting for T in the middle of the 14th century. That came in after the middle of the 15th century. Go ahead. Here are some diplomas from in Old Swedish. This stack represents 6 years of diplomas. There was an oddity. It took when you see this is a diploma, which is nothing more than a letter, and it's usually a legal document. It was a legal document to record wills, transfer of property, court cases, and things like this. And what's nice about the diplomas is they're all dated. And they're recorded usually on vellum, and they've been preserved because they had a legal basis. And not only are they dated, but you also know where they were written. The next one, please. In order to go from that diploma, which is hard to read and has lots of abbreviations on, you need to create the index and create it into Latin letters. And here's another diploma that is occurred with. And it's these books that contain this type of diploma. But for some reason, the diplomas, in 1900, the diplomas had only been indexed until 1348. Then for some reason, they had been indexed from 1400 to 1420. So you had a 52-year period where there was no record of these, or easy access to these diplomas. Then, by the 1920s or 30s, they succeeded in getting up to 1355. But in the last 40 years, they have indexed these from 1355 to 1374, some of them only coming out in the last couple of years. Now what's amazing is relative to Kensington and Runestone, these were never studied. They were never studied at all in relation to the Kensington and Runestone. Now, one of the reasons for that is that The Scandinavians always said the Kensington Runestone was false, it shouldn't be studied, it should not be studied. So there was no one in Scandinavia who was looking at the diplomas and saying, oh, well, these are the words that are on the Kensington Runestone. Well, the first thing I was interested in, and the next one, the diplomas clearly show that T and TH are used without logic. That there was no distinction. I have the dates that these words are found in. That there was no distinction. And this is very important for orthography because it shows that orthography could be spelled with a TH. And not necessarily T. That there's a dual spelling, or maybe not a dual pronunciation, maybe a dual pronunciation. I'll leave that to Professor Williams. But certainly that the fact that if the word is spelled with a TH, it means it could be a paga. And that means it's a medieval word. So now I have a 14th century explanation for orthography. It's not that orthoga with D is a modern word and hence the Kensington Runestone is a forgery. Oh, just a second, there's another explanation. I would ask myself, why haven't the Scandinavian experts and others who pronounce on this brought up the 14th century explanation? They seldom do. You can find, well, I mean, the diplomas are great for me because you don't have to know very much about medieval Swedish compared to looking at a big document. They're really legal form letters. They're the paradigm and they're repeated over and over again. And what's nice is you go from diploma to diploma and you can see how the spelling varies. Now, they also are using a set expression. Now, this word means exception, most of it. Without exception. And they're talking about selling property, and you have to buy all the houses, all the outworks, all the roads, all the schools, without exception. So it's almost in every document. So I just went through, I was flying to China, and the flight was 30 hours, and I went through, 2,000 diplomas on the flight, and just checked one word at a time in every diploma, to find these things. I went through diplomas many times, but I couldn't look at trying to find 20 words at a time. I just went through one at a time. So here you can say that my thesis, that the word on the Kensington Runestone is orthography with TH and not a D, has a basis in fact. I'm only dealing in evidence. I will not deal in opinion. However, that doesn't prove that the Kensington Runestone is correct. It negates the argument that the word has to be orthoga and therefore modern. All I did was give a 14th century explanation. And that's more or less been my technique all the time. There's other words besides, you see the word oversold there. Now, there's many other words on the Kensington Runestone that are now authenticated by these diplomas. I have written a draft paper which is still under review. Many questions that you might have heard about have been answered by these diplomas. Basically, there's very few things left from a linguistic point of view that need to be addressed. Certainly, the Kensington Runestone needs to be studied further. We need to get more and more of this evidence to come to a final conclusion. And I might point out that the Riksarkivet, the National Archives in Sweden, is continuing to translate or index these diplomas. And 1375 is coming out this year. I'm now on the list to get it when it gets out. And I'm in email correspondence with them, and they've been very cooperative. But remember now, we're going to get another 25 years of diplomas that will be indexed over the next 50 years. And there has to be a lot of evidence in those diplomas that will help us come to a final determination, in my opinion, on the case. before coming to the double dots, I want to mention something else. One of the things about the form letters that are so useful is that you have a feeling for the speech at the time. Because when there's exceptions to the form letter, and some of these letters look the same in 1420 as they do in 1340, because they've been copied. But when you start seeing exceptions from the paradigm, you have a good feeling that that's the speech of the writer. And a lot of other indications come in. Quite often, the main letter is very formal. And when you look in the back, it would use something like P-O, P-O, which was thought not to exist till after 1400, but you'll find it on diplomas in the back of the diplomas where the writer has just said, this is on such and such farm, you use P-O. So some of these unorthodox or ad hoc comments in the back of the letters have been very, very informative. And so that's what I look to. And Everson in Norway always said that the exception in writing is the rule of speech. There are some people who don't view it that strongly. But fundamentally, what I found is that when we found these exceptions in these diplomas in 1350 to 1370, that these are the things that agreed with what you find on the Kensington. And there's another reason that it happened. There were big changes that occurred that I observed in these diplomas, starting certainly in the 1360s. You had the Black Death in 1350. You also had another Black Death called the Child's Plague in Sweden in 1369. Many of the writers were priests who died out because they administered to the sick. You find that the writing deteriorates as time goes on, particularly in this period of time. On the Kensington Runestone, there's two phenos, which is this, spelled with an O in the end, phenocene and phenocene. This stone, this island. Prior to observing these diplomas, Pheno was thought to occur only one time in 1348. I found in these diplomas in this 25-year period over 25 Phenos. And what's interesting is they don't exist later in Old Swedish. So of the 25 Phenos we now know, two of them are the Kensington Runestone. How on earth, I asked, how did it get on the Kensington Runestone? No one knew about it, really. The Pheno was only reported in 1904 in the Old Swedish grammar. It was first indexed in the diploma similar to these books in 1877. The only way somebody in 1898 could know about Pheno was to have poured through these documents to find it. And I don't think that was a reasonable thesis. But anyway, it became quite interesting to see that suddenly all kinds of Phenos were coming out. Sometimes I read a diploma, I had Pheno, I was very excited because I found it something that was thought to be very rare. Then it was on the next page, and the next page, and the next page. I spent all night going through those diplomas. It was exciting times. Now, I worked on the double dot. There again, my strategy is to try to get a 14th century explanation. One of the things that I recognized very early, and I have quoted in my earlier papers, is that the double dots were used for vowel length. They're found in Iceland, using that certainly after 1350. They're much earlier in the German literature. That's probably where they came into Iceland originally. They're also in some Norwegian documents. So that the fact that you have a double dot themselves means that there's a possibility that that's what the double dots on the Kensington Runestone indicate. I'm not going to pronounce why they would be indicating vowel length in those particular words, but that's another issue. The other thing was you find that the abbreviation marks in medieval times also use the double dot. And also there was a diphthong made up of two letters, each of which had a dot, which is rather interesting in itself. Could you give me slide 7? There you see the O with the dot. That's the equivalent of the double dot in the modern communication. That's the E. If you find an ordure, that's the vowel sound. Then you have a dotted Y. And there's quite a few of these. Who's there? But this is a diphthong. But what's interesting is the part of the site where I got this. This was a writing characteristic. It was actually used to represent the monophone, which was just U, or the O with the line through it, if you wish, or the O double dot. So we're using this notation to indicate the monophone. I'm just projecting some evidence to indicate why on the Kensington Runestone we have a double dot above the room. And there is other evidence that tends to support that, in my mind. Can you get 6? There is a runic inscription, a very famous one in Greenland, called the King's Zorak inscription. It has a double dotted rune. Albeit it's not above the rune. Paul Bitter, the famous Danish philologist, indicated it's probably good for the diphthong, but we cite it saying that it could just well stand for the monophone, which is the U itself. So I just only discovered this or thought of this in the last 2 or 3 months. It does show, in my mind, that the Scandinavian records has not been thoroughly researched to try to solve this problem. You have number 8. There's a double dot over MR. That's an abbreviation for mark or marker. It just goes to show you that the double dot had could have a number of meanings. Quite possibly most people forgot what it meant because almost every letter has mark on it. Because we were talking about selling property for so much, so it was a very common thing. How many people know the origin of the U.S. dollar sign today? You superimpose U over the X is where the dollar sign comes from. We see the dollar sign every day, but nobody really, except this gentleman, knows where it comes from. And I just want to say that the double dot over mark was known to everybody. Every day you had and you used that sign all through Scandinavia in the 14th century. By the way, this document's interesting because you also see how there's an A dot there. That's for the A sound, as opposed to ah. You also have the dot over the O in there. There's another double dot in R. But in the Vesper Gothic law, you have a double dot over M. It stands for man, or the old spelling also for man, which is Mather. You know Mather Air Force Base in Sacramento? It means man. That's the old Viking word for man, Mather. And it became a family name, as you see. But it was also used for mark, marker, and man, and Mather in Vesper Gothic law. So I just want to point out that the normal thought about this abbreviation mark was it usually stood for a nasal, the M or the N going at the end of the word. And that possibly also stands for Willem on the Kensington Runestone. This is a study in itself, and it's just beginning. Ready? this is just a collection of words to show how the spelling of the words on the Kensington Runestone vary quite a bit. You have certain, these are actually out of various diplomas in Norway. So, you know, there's a possibility that this song is represented by that on the Kensington Runestone is a possibility. I don't know. I've come up with another 14th century explanation, but it's also very intriguing because this song only existed primarily in the 14th century. What was going on in Scandinavian languages, you're losing the ending, the pronunciation of the word was changing. So this went out of the language. This was not a modern characteristic. I've always thought of the Kensington Runestone as a Russian doll. No sooner do you open up one doll and you got another one to open up. So one solution leads to two more questions, generally. I'm looking forward very much to the next speaker. I think it's really tremendous that Professor Williams has consented to come here. I don't know if we have any time for any questions, Howard. Sure. Okay. You can write your questions down on the blue card or any color you want. And thank you very much for your kind attention.